Horror is the genre that most often you'll hear the question, how can you even enjoy this, posed by people outside the community? While I'd consider this channel a testament to how I can enjoy horror, the interesting truth is that there's not one universal answer to the question, just in the same way that there's not one universal type of horror. Generally, the answer has something to do with some form of excitement chasing or looking for the opportunity to experience fear in a safe setting, but once you start getting specific, like, say, asking a body horror fan how they can enjoy films all about cutting, slicing, screwing, and squirming into human meat, you start getting very different responses than what you'd get from a dork like me, who's very publicly into more psychological and slow burn horror. What I mean to illustrate here is that not all horror and thriller fans are the same, if the comments under my videos prove anything. So today I wanted to look at that question. How can you enjoy something like this, and apply it to what potentially is the most depraved subject matter that a horror movie can cover, and yet is treated as one of the most tame? To illustrate my point, let me introduce you to Bailey Sarian. Actually, realistically, I don't have to introduce you to her with her 7.4 million subscribers. Bailey Sarian is a content creator whose primary focus is talking about stories of true crime, stuff like murder and cults and whatnot. She's a pretty evocative storyteller and seems to know a lot about what she's discussing. What's interesting, though, is that while she's talking about this gnarly stuff, she's doing her makeup. And pretty well, I should add, not knowing much about makeup myself. Bailey Sarian has created an entire new genre of content creation on YouTube known as true crime makeup, a genre which has become so wildly popular that there are many other successful true crime makeup influencers. It would almost be surprising seeing something so relaxing or pleasing like a makeup video being juxtaposed with such morbid content, but it's not, because if you've looked into true crime as a genre at all, its audience is almost all women. And that's not an exaggeration. Scott A. Bond, a criminology professor and author who focuses on a number of different types of crime, states that, according to his network programming executives, about 80% of the audience for true crime television and podcasts is made up of women. In an article called Why the True Crime Audience is Primarily Female, Bond states his belief that not only do women tend to empathize more with victims in stories of true crime, most of which tend also to be female, but that they also tend to pay a lot more attention to the actions of the perpetrators themselves, almost as a survival tool. It's interesting. Over 75% of annual murder victims are men, according to FBI data, so why would true crime be a good place to get info for survival? Well, you have to remember, true crime content creators aren't talking about people just getting shot in muggings or random encounters. They're looking for something juicier. That's why so many true crime shows tend to focus on serial killers. They're simply more sensational. More bodies equals more of a crazy, evil, crazy person, and that's what makes good money, so it's what they do. It's business, plain and simple. You may have guessed, though, that in cases of serial killing, victims are primarily women. Think now to any of the true crime content you've ever consumed, be it something like The Morbid Podcast, a series I used to be super into during my delivery driver days, or something more accessible like BuzzFeed Unsolved, another series I love. What type of content gets the most attention? Are they always pushing the hardest? Serial killers. And who's there in the comments for those shows? A lot of women trying to figure out how to avoid getting serial killed. Now, I mentioned this idea of murder being treated as tame and brought up true crime makeup as proof. Does that imply I think makeup or women in general are tame? No, not at all. You like what you like, and truthfully, these creators are making darker content than a majority of the creators on the website. The reason I bring them up as murder being treated as tame is that the meme of women liking true crime is widespread and very well known. TikTok, Pinterest, Tumblr, Instagram, it doesn't matter where you go. There will be a dude with a towel on his head portraying a woman consuming true crime content. We, as a culture, and especially women, have become very comfortable with the concept of murder. More than a quarter of my audience is female, which, as a dude making the content I'm making, is kind of a fucking miracle in itself. I hate to tell you this, my loyal female viewers, but I don't think this video will keep you from getting murdered. Unless, of course, someone is holding a gun to your head and forcing you to watch a video essay for your life. No, this video is going to be kind of about how... And no, I don't mean that literally. It would be insane to claim that the majority of people are morally on board with the taking of another person's life, despite what people sometimes want you to believe. What I really mean is, there are a number of topics that are sort of taboo in fiction, and especially the horror fiction world. Stuff like child murder, or SA. It's not illegal to include in your film, at least most of the time, and yet most creators, at least the more mainstream, tend to be rather hesitant to depict such actions. People sometimes like to throw around words like gratuitous or exploitative when they see content that makes them personally uncomfortable, even if it's presented in a respectful and relevant light. And to be fair, those particular topics are rather unpleasant to consider, whether in fiction or not. They represent some of the worst things that can be done to a person by another. But somehow, for some reason, murder doesn't get treated in the same way. And again, I'm being specific with my wording. Controversies over death and violence in movies occur all the time. However, in cases where the death is dressed up, presented as part of a mystery or a thriller, and given relevance as more than just a death for death's sake, people are a lot more on board with it. For a lot of people, as long as murder has meaning, it is justified, at least in the narrative sense. But let's return to that look at serial killers, that staple of the genre and the most extreme version of a murderer a person can be. Ironically, at least as they're portrayed in many pieces of fiction, most serial killers attach a great deal of meaning to their killings, and depending how the story frames the killer, we sometimes feel, as audience members, that we're on the same team as the killer. There's a broad version of this feeling that I enjoy dipping into from time to time, and that version is the feeling you get when you watch a slasher movie, especially a campy or classic one. I sat down and watched the first 4 Friday the 13th movies back to back one day recently, and became very aware of the fact that in each movie, the victims of initially Pamela and later Jason Voorhees are like water balloons, created for the sole reason of being destroyed. Watching the first movie, you might be a little on edge, sympathetic to the fear of the horny campers as they're picked off by forces they don't understand, but by the time that 4th movie rolls around, you realized your only common denominator, your rock in a current of scrambling to be corpses, is Jason. And suddenly, you're on Team Jason. When a team gets macheted, you cheer now because your favorite serial killer just put another one on the board. Your favorite serial killer. Y'all remember that thing on Tumblr a while ago where teenage girls were romanticizing and creating thirst posts for the guys behind the tragedy at Columbine? Or the fact that Richard Ramirez, also known as the Night Stalker, managed to get briefly married in prison, at least before his wife realized he had murdered a 9-year-old? Or what about how, despite the fact that he killed a confirmed minimum of 30 women, one of the most frequent topics of conversation as it applies to Ted Bundy was how attractive and charming he was? Our priorities as it comes to killers, serial or otherwise, have never been fully locked down for some reason. The most likely answer is that some humans are simply more susceptible to emotional manipulation, or at least tend to let emotions triumph over logic and morality, but we're all weirdly guilty of this. Who is your favorite serial killer? And I mean real one, like actually took real people's lives. It probably sucks to admit, but when I asked that question, especially without any warning, a lot of you probably had a real answer. A killer whose style or techniques are particularly interesting to you, or the first one you heard about as a kid, or the one that most resembles a fictional character. I probably would have said Gacy because of his horrifying and iconic usage of clown makeup. He stands out to me. But to call a child murderer your favorite anything is insane. Maybe I'm tipping the scale a little bit by phrasing it in that way, calling it your favorite over, the one you find most interesting or something like that, but let's be honest, you had an answer. And if you didn't, great, you have the moral high ground over me. Keep that streak up and don't comment about how much better person you are. Trust in your heart, I already know. So, one of my favorite fictional serial killers, a descriptor that wildly ups the okayness of such a sentiment, is a man who we simply know as Jack. He built a house. We were talking earlier about being on the same team as your story's serial killer, and the way the movie The House That Jack Built by Lars von Trier goes about telling its story, or rather, how the titular Jack goes about telling his own story, proves just how flexible this kind of relationship between murderer and audience member can be. As we watch the film, we're learning about Jack murders after they have happened. He's telling the story of his life as a serial killer to a character we don't yet recognize, and during his retelling, we're shown a number of specific murders, picked out of a much larger bunch. These selections aren't random, though. In fact, each of them, at least in Jack's eyes, prove a very specific point about the artistry and elegance behind his killings, and how he is entitled or even obligated to take these lives and to twist what remains into grotesque and horrifying shapes. To him, he's completely justified, and with him as our primary narrator, or at least one of two, there are moments that we almost find ourselves, once again, aligned with Jack and hoping for his success. It's to a lesser degree than you might get with someone like Leatherface or Jason. Jack's cruelty and depravity take center stage in this film, and the deaths that come as a result of those qualities are much less fun than your run-of-the-mill slasher. But let me describe a brief scene from the film to show you what I mean. After completing a murder in his victim's house, Jack, who has gone about this entire process up until this point somehow both sloppily and neurotically, barely escapes being caught by a police officer while cleaning up after himself at the crime scene. He escalates the situation, makes the officer wildly more suspicious, and does about everything in his power to get caught, but somehow manages to avoid it, a running habit of Jack's. As he flees the scene, though, the dead body of his victim is dragged behind his vehicle for a number of miles, her body being destroyed by the friction of the road, and it's only when Jack pulls up to his serial killer hideout place, because yeah, he has one of those, that he realizes he left a big bloody trail from the scene of the crime straight to his doorstep. Now let me briefly pull you out of this description by reminding you that during all of this, you're well aware that Jack is a terrible man, and his being caught by the police would absolutely be a good thing. But you've had to sit there with him as he manically cleaned the house, as he wrestled with panic and anxiety in close calls. You had to feel the energy of it all, the chaos and the desperation to make it out without being caught, that when Jack does almost make it out, you're almost relieved. And when Jack realizes his mistake, his frustration is your frustration. Of course, you wouldn't kill someone in real life, I hope, but this movie, Jack himself, has been begging you to just try seeing things from his point of view. To at least imagine you could agree with his actions and try to go from there. So, in this moment, after being in such close proximity with Jack, after being forced to look at things from his point of view, you can see the situation and just for a moment, start to guess how you'd react if you did the terrible thing Jack did. If you were certain you'd be caught for it and your life would never be the same. If someone found out about the murder you committed. And then, when it starts raining, Jack isn't the only one relieved. This rain literally represents a man getting away with murder, all remaining evidence of his crime being washed away, and it feels good somehow. You feel glad Jack got away with it. Now, I'm speaking super generally at this point. I can't pretend that this character isn't wildly upsetting to a number of people, even anecdotally. The last time I watched this film, I was showing it to my girlfriend, and she had a really hard time with it. It's not that she hated it, it was just too much for her. To be fair though, she was much more focused on the child death in that film, and I've already discussed how general audiences feel about something like that, so. There's another big character in this film, one I mentioned earlier, and his name is Virgil. Yes, that Virgil, like the one from Dante's Inferno. We realize pretty late into the story that Jack is telling the story of his life while he's being shepherded to his place in the afterlife. Hell, specifically. Virgil, as he exists in our story at least, is a beacon of morality, our reminder to look past the grand expressions and empty platitudes of a man who, at his core, feels he's winning a game the rest of the world didn't even know it was playing. When Jack triumphantly expresses the beauty of the sacrificial lamb going to the slaughter from the unharmed outside perspective, Virgil reminds us that, in many cases, we are the lamb, and we don't see the violence as quite so artistic as our butcher. Really, the only time you can be on board with a killer is when that killer convinces you that you're safe. It's easy to find Ghostface's antics exciting or even funny because he's a wholly fictional character. It's real easy to call a shooter attractive when you're not the one he's pointing a gun at. Either way, that degree of separation is sometimes all it takes for those evil actions to be diluted enough that you can look past them. It's easy to see Jack as our hero because he's the one telling the story, and he's telling it in such a way that you feel like he thinks you get it. Maybe he does, maybe he doesn't, but it's how he wants you to feel, because why would he kill someone who gets it? It's a fatal mistake to attempt to apply logic or reason to the actions of a person who clearly gets by just fine without either. Sometimes, though, it goes even further than the killer's behavior. Sometimes you believe that you're safe because other people tell you that. But if they're wrong, well, that's potentially the most dangerous position you can be in, completely oblivious. The main agent in the film The Silence of the Lambs is a woman named Clarice Starling, and she is not oblivious. In any scene where she communicates with serial murderer and cannibal Hannibal Lecter, despite whatever professionalism and boldness she displays, you can see how uncomfortable and anxious her interactions with the man make her. The rest of the people who interact with Lecter, not so much. Almost anytime anyone sees Lecter, he's restrained or behind incredibly strong glass or bars, and this fact has tricked the majority of Lecter's caretakers into thinking they're safe, despite the known information that when members do get close to him, he lashes out and hurts people. For the FBI to be working with a serial killer like Hannibal Lecter, even acknowledging his expertise, is an unsettling concept if you really think about it. Here we have the entity which is supposed to represent the fullest extent of our nation's security forces, the people who are, and again, I repeat, supposed to be defending our way of life, and for one reason or another, suddenly they're working with the kind of person who life needs to be defended from. They're doing it to try and catch another serial killer. It's weird and cyclical, and Batman would probably have a kind of shit philosophical take about it all. You know, the amount of killers in the world staying the same and all that. But that's the logic that the people here are working with. Lecter's already locked up. What's the real danger now? If there's no threat, why not try to use him to stop another serial killer? Doesn't that make sense? Is that not a form of Lecter paying at least some of his debt to humanity? I really can't say. Criminals turn each other in all the time. Our justice system is partially built on the testimony of the very figures being processed by it. But it's that idea that someone could be so good at killing innocent people, so depraved to such a degree and effect that the violence is evolved past its senseless descriptor, past the argument to be made that there was no reason for it. When we talk to one serial killer to try to learn about another, we're telling the world and that first killer that they're considered an expert, that the murders they committed actually served a purpose, that there was something to be gained through killing. It's a lot like the women who listen to true crime podcasts so they can avoid making the same mistakes. Those killers, the one those women are so terrified of meeting, have become examples of what to look for and what to avoid and who to be suspicious of. Sure, it took a few bodies to get there, but now we know more about a killer's psychology and we can avoid them ourselves. It's odd. There's a line that shows up in a lot of murder mystery stories. I think the last time I heard it was in Longlegs, and it always goes something like, "This is the killer's MO. He's killed before, and he will kill again." Or even something like, "We just don't know enough. All we can do is wait to see who the next victim is." And I get the point that's being made, that whatever detective or investigator still feels so in the dark about the figure they're chasing, but doesn't the way that's phrased make it sound like it's almost a part of the investigation? Like, the only way to really learn more about this killer is to let him keep killing, in the hopes that further victims will clarify a pattern or mistake or something? I'm looking at it from a purely fictional perspective. That can't be how actual murders are investigated, right? Right? I wrote this essay because I've been trying to wrap my head around what, in American culture, might be considered completely off limits to talk about on TV or film or books. And I realized I've been looking at the content of these films like it's about morality, but it's just not. Let me clarify a little YouTube thing that some of you seem to be confused by. When a YouTuber uses the word unalive instead of, well, the word that's a stand-in for, they're not doing it because the concept makes them deeply uncomfortable or because they think it's not okay to bring attention to that sort of stuff. They're doing it because it's more marketable. YouTube has an automatic content filter that secretly does a lot of work behind the scenes before and during a video's release, and one of the big things it's doing is checking to see how advertiser-friendly a video could be. Advertisers don't want to be attached to controversy or morbidity because that affects sales, and so YouTube has a list of words, phrases, and topics that, if mentioned in a video, even passively, trigger a reaction in that video's visibility, causing it to plummet in views and likes. They call it shadow banning. For a YouTuber to cover something like unaliving and still make money, that YouTuber has to dance like a madman around the concept in a way that keeps not just YouTube, but his sponsors, editing team, and fans comfortable. But I've said the word death a lot. Death, death, death. Same with murder, murderer, killer, any number of things like that. As far as I can tell / hope, this video's not completely screwed. That's because while death is one of the most serious things a human being can encounter, our feelings about it are not necessarily controversial. It's usually sad. It usually affects people. It happens to everyone. Even the act of killing, while evil and scary, is not a concept that requires much thought to form an opinion on. It's bad. Advertisers aren't generally worried about their consumers thinking they endorse death or murder because what actual business would? So directors can make movies about killers and not be called killers themselves. People can be killed on screen in something as quote-unquote family-friendly as a Marvel movie, and that's just okay. It's part of the stakes. If I made a video that was just fully about Jesus Christ, like the actual literal religious figure, that video would be wildly more controversial than a video about Saw, a movie where a woman gets her jaw wired to a bear trap. Jesus, as far as I'm concerned, is an infinitely more ethical and moral character than, Jigsaw, but Jesus is also religion. One of the most contested and controversial topics of conversation ever, anywhere, anytime. Making a video about Jesus Christ might spread more good, or at least morally loaded content into the world, but what if I upset members of a different religion? What if I get parts of my explanation of Jesus wrong and upset Christians? Weirdly, it's safer to talk about someone who's universally hated than someone who's partially beloved, because what's more unifying than anger? We love killers. We love to hate them. We love murders. We love to fear them. And we love violence because we love that in at least this moment, it's not happening to us. But if that's how you really feel, get closer. Look harder. Remember what you're actually looking at. See how much you love your killer then.